All righty. Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of One Plus One, your place for inconvenient truth telling and myth busting. And on the program, we are rejoined by returning champion Jeff Cohen, who is one of America's leading media critics. He was the founder of Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, which continues to actually be one of the best media critic organizations holding corporate media to account, and even sometimes left leaning media when they jump the shark. Jeff, through the 80s and 90s and early 2000s, was often a guest contributor to CNN, Fox News, Fox Business Channel, and MSNBC, where he was producer of Donahue Live until they were shut down for their editorial stance being against the Iraq War. He is the author of Cable News Confidential, My Misadventures in Corporate Media. He continues to be a prominent online activist with Roots Action, and he also has been an associate professor for journalism, and he was the founding director of the Park Center for Independent Media, an endowed chair, an endowed chair from 2008 to 2018. He's the author and co-author of several books about corporate media and its hideous subgenre of far-right media. And we're here to talk about past corporate media legends, other and other corporate media junk journalist legends, and where does the people power movement go from here? So first off, Jeff, welcome back to the program.
It's great to be with you, Youri.
Likewise, it's always an honor to speak to you. And so Jeff, so my first question, since I feel like this is going to be one of the more interesting programs because it's more or less a history program, and I'm a history buff and I love history. So let's talk about all of these legendary corporate media heads who I think both of us politely can say are overrated. Others who start off as far-right shock jocks and later rebranded themselves, so the first one I want to ask you about is how do you assess the legacy of the CBS leading anchor Walter Cronkite?
Well, Cronkite's an interesting figure. If you watch movies about the Vietnam War, especially in 1965, he was just a cheerleader for the war. He was a cheerleader for the president of the puppet regime in South Vietnam, the US puppet regime. And he turned after much of the establishment had grown tired of the war that they referred to as a quagmire. It killed, I don't know, 1 million, 2 million Vietnamese, mostly civilians. And he raised a question in a special on CBS News that have the generals been lying to us? Has the president been lying to us? This seems like an endless war. Is there really light at the end of the tunnel? He didn't make a critique politically of the war. He didn't talk about the racism of the war, but he talked about the effectiveness of the war and that they were lying to the public. And that part of it was true. It's just a partial critique. And then a little later, he did an excellent show called The Selling of the Pentagon about the military-industrial complex. But so he's got a mixed legacy. He played a big role in cheering on the Vietnam War, and thankfully, a few years later, he turned on it. And it was important when he did. There's the famous comment, allegedly from President Johnson, "We've lost Walter, we're losing America."
Yeah.
And he was considered the most trusted man in the country. So it was important what he did when he finally, slowly, too late, but better late than never, turned against the Vietnam War.
And he also was famously against the Iraq War, was he not? The second Iraq War.
Yeah, but he had no power then. Yeah, when like a lot of corporate liberal big media figures, when they no longer have power, they often start telling the truth more readily. And he was one of them. He did a lot of good things after he'd completely retired, but then he no longer had a megaphone. Dan Rather was an awful anchor. He was a cheerleader for attacking the Afghanistan. He was a cheerleader for the Mujahideen in the 1990s. He was a cheerleader for the invasion of Iraq. And then only when he got terminated years later did he start talking about, oh, corporations have too much power over the media. And, I hear there's a new documentary. I can't bring myself to watch it about Dan Rather. But Rather was always overrated, I believe. But he said some good things after he was terminated at CBS. And
And
he was actually saying some critical things of the mainstream media.
actually, that was actually the second person I was going to ask you about, which is Dan Rather. So actually, continuing on actually with what you
Yeah.
were saying about Dan Rather, who, as you say, one of the most overrated journalists in the world. Uh, can you actually talk to? Well, actually, before I ask that, well, yeah, can you talk to us about how sometimes there's this thing called damning with feigned no that sometimes folks give
Yeah.
too much praise to the media when they sometimes do their job. So Dan Rather, I think a lot of people were I think a lot of people would know him, certainly from your generation, from the baby boomers. Him confronting Nixon when Nixon bashing, and I guess you could even say Nixon derangement syndrome, was all over the place with Watergate. And he famously confronted George H.W. Bush when he was the vice president under Ronald Reagan for his role in the Iran Contra scandal. And
Yeah, you've
yeah,
got it right. You're bringing out a couple of the things he did that was aggressive journalism. Most of what he did was just quote propaganda on the system. He famously, this doesn't get as much play, but after 9/11, he famously said, wherever the president wants me to line up, that's where I'll be. Just tell me where. That's the opposite of what a journalist is supposed to say in a democracy. And he was horrific when it really mattered, when the country was being propelled to war in different places against Muslims. And we needed journalists to ask tough questions. And he was basically admitting, I'm not going to ask any of those tough questions. Wherever he wants me to line up, just tell me where. So when it really counted, you're right. He came out, he was very aggressive with Nixon near the end. He was aggressive.
exactly.
Yeah.
Near the
He
end.
was, yeah, he was aggressive with George H.W. Bush when Bush was running for president against
Michael Dukakis.
against Dukakis. He asked a question about Iran Contra. But that's what journalists are supposed to do, and you've basically enumerated the few times he did it.
But now I was a bit. There's another thing, and I didn't have time to watch it, but I'm gonna try to find Dan Rather's famous appearance on the Letterman show. This was the first show after the horrific attacks on 9/11, and apparently Max Blumenthal, very well known independent journalist, sometimes controversial journalist or controversial journalist. In his book, The Management of Savagery, where he talks about the rise of Islamic extremism, how we got Donald Trump, and the just litany of disasters and the unstable world which we've inherited. Max Blumenthal said that there's something in the interview with Letterman about Dan Rather, which people often do not grill Rather about, and that was Rather claiming he saw Muslims cheering in the streets or on balconies when the 9/11 attacks actually happened. And
Yeah.
I'm curious your thoughts on that, and how did you and I'm sure you've seen both Bill Moyer's Buying the War. That's Moyers' documentary where he criticizes the corporate media's role in giving us the Iraq War. And I'm pretty sure you've also seen The War You Don't See, by John Pilger, where your former colleague Steve Rendell was interviewed there, and Pilger, is grilling Dan Rather, and I think it's safe to say if you compare and contrast him on the Moyers program and him on John Pilger, he does express a lot of regrets and does say that if we journalists, including myself, if right from the opening pop, we should have been confronting, the Bush administration, and says that you can make the case that had we done our jobs, we would not have gone to war in Iraq. So I'm curious your thoughts on.
The corporate mainstream media, which supported the invasion, almost 98%. There were a few exceptions. One was Phil Donahue on MSNBC, and one was what was then the Knight Ridder Washington Bureau, and there's a movie about that. But yeah, when Rather was on Letterman, that's one of the places where he said, just, the president should just tell me where to line up. The one thing that doesn't get talked about is that in the 1990s, the 1980s, even a bigger CIA operation than the Contras was arming the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. And, they had this weird program, I think Schultz at the State Department for Reagan, they were going throughout the Arab world, getting some of the most fanatical people, bringing them with the help of the Saudis, bringing them to Afghanistan to fight the Soviets. And it ultimately led to Al-Qaeda. Everyone knows it. There's no dispute about the history I've just given. And Dan Rather was the most supportive journalist in our country of the Mujahideen and of U.S. support for the alleged freedom fighters in Afghanistan. So that's the irony of Dan Rather, that when the extreme Islamists were fighting the Soviets, he was all for arming them and training them militarily. And then when it blows back,
and not even talking about the far right skeletons in their closet, which they were open advocates of, actually.
Yeah, but there was no. There's later after 9/11. No remorse, and now he's fanatical about going after Al-Qaeda and invading Iraq and invading everywhere. So again, he was an establishment journalist. Moyers had been at CBS, had been a spokesperson for Lyndon Johnson during the escalation of the Vietnam War. I got to know Bill Moyers very, very well. Really respect him. I mean, after what he witnessed on the inside of how the U.S. engages in these wars of empire and kills all these innocent people, Bill, it changed his life. And Bill became this independent, aggressive person who was not going to stand for lies about U.S. wars from then on. And you bring up John Pilger, who passed away last year. John Pilger is a journalistic hero. Every independent media person in the world who knows of John Pilger's work admires him. He was able to bring an independent voice and get a lot of his stuff into mainstream media, especially in England. He wrote columns in mainstream dailies. His documentaries, which questioned Western imperialism and U.S. empire, were on mainstream television in England. John Pilger was a fan of FAIR, the Media Watch group I started. And you're right, he made that great documentary, The War You Don't See, that everyone should watch, about the media's role in bringing us, the Iraq War didn't just kill a bunch of innocent people. It totally destabilized the Middle East. And it led to the formation of ISIS. Everyone knows it. It's not a disputable fact of history. The mainstream media, as you said, Youri, it probably couldn't have happened without the U.S. mainstream media in our country and in England. And Rupert Murdoch was a big part of it in both countries, But in my country, the New York Times front page was pushing for war based on lies. The Washington Post had dozens of editorials in the 6 months leading up to Bush Cheney's invasion of Iraq, promoting the invasion. So you had the two leading newspapers of liberal media pushing the Bush Cheney. So Murdoch was a big problem, but so were the corporate liberal media. We used to call them in the 60s Cold War liberals. Now we call them militaristic liberals. You know, they're many of them are still Cold War liberals. But yeah, they were pushing for the invasion of Iraq. Even the liberal magazine that's considered the magazine of magazines, New Yorker, with all their Ivy League journalists, editorially, with one exception, they had one dissenting voice, maybe two, but basically the magazine endorsed the invasion. How can you be smart? How could you be a journalist and not see that Bush and Cheney were lying us into a war? I mean, independent journalists were debunking these lies as soon as they were happening. I was new to, you know, internet research was new in 2002, but they had the lie about Al-Qaeda. There was a meeting between Saddam Hussein's people and Al-Qaeda in Prague. Never happened. The lies about the aluminum tubes that, according to the New York Times, Iraq had acquired them and they could only be used for nuclear weapons, when in fact they were used for weather balloons. Everyone knows that. And you could know that within a week of the lie. So there were independent journalists, and FAIR was part of this, fair.org. FAIR was exposing these lies, but the New Yorker magazine, with all their Ivy League talent, they weren't smart enough, apparently, to see through it and to oppose this invasion that so destabilized the Middle East and has led to so many bad things.
How do you assess the legacy of Ted Koppel, who I believe was ABC Nightline?
Yeah.
How do you
Yeah.
assess how do you
Koppel
assess his
was,
legacy?
he was a Cold War liberal of the worst kind. FAIR's, one of the most important studies FAIR ever did, and they've done dozens, was the very first one we ever did. And it was studying 40 months of Nightline. And Nightline was the most prestigious show. It was the biggest show, the most important show. All the TV journalists thought it was the best show. So FAIR just looked at the guest list. 40 months. Who got on? It was 2,000. It was like 850 TV shows, 2,500 guests. Who got on the show and who didn't? And basically, we found there were very few people of color. There were very few women. There were virtually no labor union representatives, no consumer rights representatives, virtually no environmentalists. There were a lot of government officials, and there were a lot of right-wingers. And the four most frequent guests during the 40-month study, this would have covered like 1986, 87, maybe 88. The four most frequent guests were Henry Kissinger, who is a close friend of Koppel's, Elliot Abrams, another war criminal, Reverend Jerry Falwell of the Moral Majority.
Wow.
And I think the fourth one was, might have been Alexander Haig. So, but the important thing of what FAIR was doing during that period, again, this is the end of the Cold War. And Chomsky and Herman pioneered in these case studies. And so at that time, the Reagan administration was trying to put all of the focus of media, get the mainstream media focus on every human rights or civil rights violation in Nicaragua,
Yes.
a country that was being invaded by the Contras. And they wanted to shift attention away from, by every indication, by every objective standard, the far, far, far worse human rights record right next door in El Salvador, because in the news media, that was a burgeoning democracy. So what we found was Koppel did 22 segments on Nicaragua, and I believe either 0 or 1 on El Salvador. So you couldn't have proven more vividly that Koppel had allowed Nightline to become basically an adjunct of Reagan administration propaganda. We were able to prove that with the New York Times also. That, again, it's a case study. There's a civil war going on in 2 countries right next door to each other. In one country, Nicaragua, the U.S. is supporting the insurgents. They created, armed, trained the Contra Army. In the other country, they're propping up a corrupt death squad government against an indigenous left-wing army and a guerrilla army. And so the New York Times, when the alleged burgeoning democracy of El Salvador would have 3 opposition leaders killed, that would be page 16. That same period, when 5 opposition leaders in Nicaragua visited U.S., encouraged the Contra War, come back to Nicaragua, are held at the airport in Nicaragua, interrogated for 4 hours, are not touched, and then are released. That's front page news. Again, it's a perfect case study. So when the far bigger human rights crimes in El Salvador that Reagan's trying to prop up are getting buried in the New York Times, and the very minor, it was a horrible war. The most powerful army, most powerful military is invading your country with a proxy army. And they still had an opposition newspaper that published through most, and that becomes front page news. You can prove that the New York Times, even though it was liberal, even though it didn't endorse Reagan for president, it supported Reagan's foreign policy. And Fair's work during this period was crucial. Chomsky and Herman's work during this period was crucial. And we totally exposed Ted Koppel's role more as propagandist than journalist, and the New York Times role more as propagandist than journalist. And I remember after some of this work at Fair, I was able to get up to Columbia, where the journalism school and the international relations school would do joint panels and debates. And I debated the foreign editor of the New York Times, and he basically had no rebuttal. You couldn't rebut our research. It was too overwhelming.
That's unbelievable. But so the more you watch Ted Koppel, the less you know. How do you assess the legacy of Peter Jennings, who's one of those he's one of those annoying Canadian exports who thinks that everything is like all fine and dandy in Canada. It's not, and then thinks that American politics is much more exciting, so he wants to go to America to be a journalist, and then just becomes just a huge like propagandist for like all things.
Well, let me tell you.
So what's your assessment of Peter Jennings?
Not as bad. He was not as bad as Rather. He was not as bad as Koppel. It's because he's Canadian that he was not as bad. He was more willing occasionally to criticize U.S. foreign policy, especially in the Middle East. He was once married to an Arab woman. And then the Zionist, the Israel Right or Wrong lobby was always calling him an anti-Semite because he was more fair-minded on the Middle East. He was more critical.
Interesting.
Yeah. And he had a great Middle East correspondent, Charles Glass, who writes great stuff to this day about the Middle East. He was based in Beirut, I believe, and for a while he was taken prisoner. So Jennings was not as bad as the others. When we had protests once, it might have been in the run-up to the first Gulf War, 1990-91. Fair and other groups had a huge protest where we went from one TV network headquarters to another in central Manhattan. And when we passed out questionnaires and quotes from at each place. We had like a 1 or 2 page handout of things they had said that were false, or panels they had that were completely biased and excluded all dissenting viewpoints. And when we went to ABC, and Rather was the anchor of CBS. I think Brokaw was the anchor at NBC.
Yeah.
And Peter Jennings was the anchor at ABC. Peter Jennings came down and talked to the protesters, and he engaged in a dialogue. It's on videotape. It's probably online somewhere.
Okay.
How do you? Yeah. So
Interesting.
we always felt if he was more the norm instead of the exception, things wouldn't have been as bad. He did not go 100% with U.S. empire, especially in the Middle East. But it was interesting. He was called an anti-Semite by the Israel Right or Wrong newspapers. But I think his next wife was Jewish. At any rate, how do you know so much about U.S. media? Where were you based? And this is before your time. You weren't even.
I'll have to answer that question for another time. I'll definitely
Okay.
definitely answer that for another time. Then I have to
Okay.
ask you then this question, which is Tim Russert. How do you assess the legacy of Tim Russert, popular NBC anchor of Meet the Press, which is still going on?
Yeah. Tim Russert was the essential establishment player. He had very narrow debates, very conventional questions. He never went beyond that center-right political spectrum that you expect from mainstream news. And then he had this other aspect where, General Electric was his boss in the last many years. And, they had this right-wing owner, Jack Welch.
Yeah.
And Welch would always talk about, if I needed to find out what's going on in Washington, because all Welch cared about was changing the regulations so General Electric could keep making more and more profits. And he said, I would always turn to Tim Russert. So Russert was not only a journalist, he was like a corporate stooge. If I worked at a mainstream outlet and the boss said, hey, we need your insights, I would say, fuck you. I'm a reporter. I'm going to put what I know and what I find on the air. I'm not going to give private consultations for you so you can inform your lobbyists. So that's something. FAIR has, if people want to look that up, I'm sure they can find that on fair.org. But Russert rarely had a progressive point of view. FAIR has documented over and over those Sunday shows are completely biased. They always have a corporate Democrat, usually one who hates Bernie Sanders. That's the left wing. And then a right-wing Republican. The debates are center versus right. They're always afraid of the left. Those shows are funded by big corporations, giving you the narrow spectrum that's the corporate spectrum. I've always said we have a spectrum in our country, political spectrum in the mainstream media, from GE to GM, from General Electric to General Motors.
That's a perfect segue. I'm going to actually switch the question. I'm actually going to switch up the questions a bit. Actually, no. I have a good follow-up. Talk to us about John McLaughlin and the McLaughlin Group, which again was another NBC program. How do you assess his legacy? And I believe McLaughlin is no longer alive, and they discontinued the McLaughlin Group. So how do you assess their legacy?
Yeah, that was a classic center right. They had one backpedaling liberal every show, at least 2 right wingers. McLaughlin was the Washington editor of the right-wing magazine called the National Review.
Oh, what's he?
And
Okay,
what was interesting was on PBS during that era, they had regular programs every week hosted by editors of the right-wing National Review, Bill Buckley's Firing Line, and the McLaughlin Group. And when we would go lobby PBS on behalf of FAIR, well, why don't you get an editor of The Nation magazine or some bookend on the left? And I mean, it's like we were talking Greek to them.
Mm-hmm.
So Yeah, McLaughlin. It was like a shouting match of the center right. Um, People blame Fox News for the center right spectrum, where you have a backpedaling liberal, a so-called Fox News liberal, against a fire-breathing right winger. But CNN and PBS invented it. Uh, PBS invented it with McLaughlin Group, and on their news hour, their nightly news show, they would have debates where the left was represented by Mark Shields. And Fair got a hold of Mark Shields. He would lecture before business groups. We got a hold of his lecture promotional material, and it said, Mark Shields does not lean to the right or the left. He's straight down the middle. It sort of proved our point that they've got a centrist debating the right. So Mark Shields was like the PBS leftist, and there would be fire-breathing right-wingers on PBS. CNN had the same thing. The first debate show on CNN was Pat Buchanan on the far right wing debating a guy named Tom Braden, who was a longtime CIA officer, but unlike others, there were some CIA officers who left the CIA and became anti-war, and that wasn't him. Braden left the CIA.
And Crossfire was the name of that program, right?
Yes, that's CNN's Crossfire. From the beginning of CNN, this was their debate show. Tom Braden was a centrist at best, a horrible debater. When he left the CIA, he wrote a famous column, Why I'm Glad the CIA is Immoral. This is when some of the CIA revelations were coming out in 67.
Why I'm glad the CIA is immoral.
Yes. Yeah, that's the headline. And but I mean, he was a horrible debater. When he left the show, they replaced him with another guy named Michael Kinsley. You've read my book, so you know about Kinsley. He represented the left on CNN for 6 years. This is Michael Kinsley from the left. And then after he was on for 6 years, a Washington Post reporter asked Michael Kinsley, how would you describe your politics? And he said, well, I'm a wishy-washy liberal. And he's the one going up against Buchanan and Novak and whoever, these fire-breathing right-wingers. So, and that's very effective propaganda. And during this era, Dukakis is losing the election. We got to this point where if you were a political junkie from TV news, you knew what the right wing stood for. They had strong principles, and you hadn't a clue what the left stood for because they're always waffling, like Michael Kinsley, and they don't seem to believe in anything. They'll sometimes say, oh, Pat, you're going a little too far. But enunciating a worldview that, working people, middle-class people getting their news from television might say, wow, I'm more with the left than the right. They had no worldview. It was the right with the worldview and the center waffling all the time. And it made liberals or the left, it made the left look like they don't believe in anything. You can't trust them. I may not agree with the right wing, but at least I can make sense of what they stand for. And this was the propaganda that we were getting out of PBS and CNN for decades. You still get it out of CNN. It's a center-right debate. MSNBC is supposed to be the liberal channel, but they have more programs hosted by Republicans and former Republicans, as long as they're anti-Trump, than they do people host, shows hosted by Bernie's type progressives. So,
exactly.
And that's considered the left-wing bookend to Fox News, but in no way, it's more a baby step left of center against a far-right Fox News, which means the center of your spectrum is 3 big steps to the right of center. That's the spectrum we've had on mainstream television in our country, decade after decade after decade.
I want you to talk to us about Pat Buchanan, and I think I said this when you were last on the program with
Jen Senko.
Yes,
Jen Senko.
with a Jen. plugging her book, The Brainwashing of My Dad. I was so shocked when I read your book and you talked about Pat Buchanan, because back when I used to consume corporate news, but then just would hate watch it and just watch it, with a critical mind always in sight. Pat Buchanan was often on NBC, was on the McLaughlin Group, it was on MSNBC, and even though he definitely was a right winger, he would push back against neoconservatism, that very reactionary,
Yeah.
imperial mindset and so forth. So I was very shocked when I read your book that he was not just an advocate of apartheid South Africa, but he was central in, the Southern racist strategy of Nixon. Pat Buchanan even openly admits this when he is interviewed in documentaries like the one on Ralph Nader. And when he ran for the Reform Party, he was attacking the Republicans from the right. And folks, if you thought Pat Buchanan was just this nice little right winger
Yeah.
that you can have a good coffee
Yeah.
with.
I debated him.
The guy was a fire breathing like
Yeah.
Christian fundamentalist. So please,
Yeah. I debated him. I
yeah,
debated him many times. Um, and I would bring out his embarrassing past that he didn't want to talk about. I remember on one show, he'd been a editorial writer for the St. Louis Globe Democrat, which was a right-wing paper. And the FBI would be circulating information about Martin Luther King Jr., smearing him as a red and what have you. And Buchanan would take that information and put it in the unsigned editorials of this right-wing newspaper where he wrote the editorials. And I remember saying to him, how does that make you any different than a Pravda propagandist getting information from the KGB about a Soviet dissident and broadcasting it? That's what you were. You were a state propagandist against a dissident. But yeah, he was a stone cold racist. He always was. He admired Franco, the fascist leader of Spain. He admired in many ways, not totally, but pretty strongly, the South African apartheid regime. He defended Nazi war criminals. And, because he opposed NAFTA, people thought, oh, maybe he's changing. Or because he opposed Israel on some issues, oh, maybe he was a MAGA Republican before they existed. He was
exactly.
Yeah, he was a populist.
He always had something against illegal immigration. He was more
Oh,
open
yeah.
about it though during the 1980s and the early 90s, and then became one of those people who would wrap up their bigotry, but in nice, soft language.
Well, yes. Well, he was a wordsmith, but he'd also wrap it up in economic populism. But he's a racist, and he paved the way. He was one of the many in the media. There would be no Donald Trump if it wasn't for decades of right-wing propaganda allowing Trump's lies to land as truth to enough millions of people. And Buchanan was a guy who pioneered in this racist economic populism and America Firstism that Trump later picked up.
But
Yeah,
then,
Buchanan. Yeah.
but there's something I have to ask you then as a follow-up question about Pat Buchanan, which is, uh, I don't think it takes somebody with a huge degree to realize Donald Trump is a flaming xenophobic racist. Some people will call him a con artist, whatever you want to call him. But when he made that big speech about how most illegal immigrants are a bunch of drug dealing Mexicans who rape and pillage people, I think a lot of people go, "Whoa, okay, wow, that's a racist scumbag right there." And yet, here's something which annoys me about Trump. It annoys me about Tucker Carlson. I'm sorry, Tucker Carlson. And I think it kind of goes back into Pat Buchanan, which is, why do you think, no offense to Ralph Nader, whom I do love, would love to have him on the program, but why is it that just because a Pat Buchanan is good on one or two issues, Too much corporations are controlling our lives. We should not be we should not be lighting Iraq on fire. And it seems as if so many left-leaning people and leftists prop up a Pat Buchanan as somebody that they should actually align with to take on
But
big
also,
bad
but
evil
also
government.
Tucker, also
And
Tucker
Tucker
Carlson.
Carlson is also the same thing.
Yeah.
Just because
Well,
he's,
again,
you know, like just because he's great on debunking anti-Russia conspiracy theories, and just because he defends Glenn Greenwald when Bolsonaro is about to harass him in Brazil, and just because Tucker Carlson was for the Iraq War, but then he saw the light of day and realized it was terrible, distanced himself from neoconservatives, props up the anti-imperialist libertarians like the Ron Pauls of the world. People give him that, and they overlook completely his
oh yeah,
phobia, his transphobia,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
and also the fact that he actually is a supporter of imperialism. He's just
yeah,
selectively, you know, an
and
imperialist.
very anti-China. I mean, the problem is, I can't psychoanalyze some of these formerly left people, but you have to look at someone as a totality. And there's that old saying that even a broken clock is right twice a day.
Mm-hmm.
You know, these right wingers and neo fascists, you're going to agree with them on a couple issues. But if you list the 20 main issues you care about, and 18 of them, they're just horrendously wrong, and 2 of them you agree with, you know, you got to call them for what they are: is ultra right wingers, neo fascists, racists. So it's silly to bring out a couple issues where you might have some agreement, because even when they're right, they're wrong. I mean, when Trump was denouncing NAFTA, it wasn't because this ground down the wages of workers in all 3 countries and was bad for the environment of North America. It's because the Mexicans got the best of us. So even when they're right, it's usually for the wrong reasons. When Pat Buchanan was a critic of Israel, and I've been a critic of Israel, I'm Jewish for, decades. How can you not criticize Israel if you care about human life? But even I believed it's probably because he doesn't like Jews. I mean, that's what they say about all of us critics of Israel. I'm a self-hating Jew and you hate Jews. With Buchanan, it was probably for the wrong reason when he criticized Israel. So even when these people agree with the left on a couple issues, it's usually, if you look at what they're saying, it's for the wrong reasons. I don't think it's too hard to be a well-reasoned, non-extremist leftist, an all-around progressive who cares about humanity, who hates bigotry, who hates war. It's not hard for me and millions of my colleagues to have a humanitarian politics, a politics of the humanitarian left. Einstein was in that. Martin Luther King Jr. was in that. All of our heroes were in that. And I mean, some people, they think they're so far left, they have to somehow defend Tucker Carlson. It makes no sense to me. Or they're so far left, there's no difference between Harris and Trump. Well, there is a difference. There are a bunch of differences. I can't stand Harris for her waffling and her position on Israel and a bunch of other things, but clearly she's not Trump. But there's some people on the ultra left that are, and it becomes a dishonesty, where they say there's no fundamental, on no major issue are they different. Abortion, Supreme Court judges, whether unions are good or bad, whether to scapegoat trans people or not. Of course there's differences. And I'm not a corporate liberal. I've been fighting the corporate liberals since I was 16, and they were making war after war. But I see the difference between a corporate liberal and a neo-fascist. So yeah, I'm diverting here, but but
Well,
that's a long,
but actually, I want to return back to the point that you just made because I think it's a very good point. So let me ask you about these two shock jocks. I think actually, I think one of the reasons why we've become so immune to just calling out racists and bigots and transphobes and so forth is because a great deal of that I think comes from the stand-up comedy world. The whole punching down as opposed to punching up at the establishment. So, how much do you find a shock jock like Don Imus, or the guy who founded the Guardian Angels that you sometimes co-host the show with, Curtis Seawall, who again also had some good points of views, like corporations are ripping off New Yorkers and so forth, but had very much. I mean, I don't like the term populist, but he was a fake right wing populist, and so how much does that the Howard Stern show and programs like South Park sort of normalize bigotry, sort of normalize bigotry in which, oh, oh, you're a stupid nigger, but hey, I'm just joking. Oh,
yeah, yeah.
these, oh,
I
these,
think, yeah,
yes, I'm curious.
I think you're smushing together too many things. Imus was a bigot. Imus, FAIR has exposed it. Anyone can go fair.org. He was an out and out bigot. Howard Stern was always a sexist. He claims in the recent years that he realizes a lot of the stuff he did was sophomoric, and I'm now mature. I've been through therapy. South Park, I don't watch it a lot, but I've watched it enough. I see it as often anti-homophobic and anti-racist.
That's true. That's true.
Yeah,
But the problem with a show like South Park is and I call South Park an animated alt right show, is they are more spiteful of liberals. You may call them insincere liberals, but they are more spiteful of liberals than they are right wing demagogues. They complain way more about reverse racism and the threat to free speech
yeah,
that racial justice warriors do.
yeah.
And yes,
Yeah,
and yes, they do defend the LGBTQIA plus community, but in the same episode, they'll also say that it's okay if if the Boy Scouts want to fire me because that is their
yeah,
choice.
yeah. You've probably watched it a lot more than me. So I'm not going to argue with you.
Unfortunately.
Yeah, I'm not going to argue with you. But the shows that I've probably seen 20, 30 episodes. I felt it was sort of funny and generally making more fun of the bigots than the anti-bigots. But I'm not going to argue with you if you feel the spectrum that the weight is the other way. Um, who else did
But I
you
think the point
mention?
I think the
Yeah.
point I'm trying to make is do you find that the Don Imuses of the world, the shock jocks of the world, the Howard Sterns of the world, uh, has made society uh like this where you will get in more trouble for calling out a racist, calling out a queer phobe, calling out a sexist than actually being damned to hell for being a
Yeah.
sexist, a queer phobe,
Yeah.
and a
I
racist and a xenophobe.
Right. Yeah, the old Howard Stern, you got to distinguish the old Howard Stern and the newer Howard Stern.
Yeah.
I miss the issue. You phrased it right. You framed it right a few minutes ago. Are you punching up or punching down? I give artists and comedians a lot more leeway. Um, they aren't columnists where you write a column and then you edit the column before you send it out. Um, sometimes they're ad-libbing. So I give artists a lot more freedom, and artists are supposed to make fun of things in societies. And I'm unwilling to debate South Park because I haven't watched enough, but I will certainly defend Jon Stewart, who punches up and not down almost all the time. There are some great comedians. George Carlin was one of the originals. They
Oh
punch
yeah,
up.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
The
So,
late
and
great George Carlin, my
yeah,
hero.
George Carlin was a big supporter of FAIR. So I think most of the comedians, the mainstream comedians, are punching up. I just watched Hassan Minaj's last show. He's talking about ethnicity in a way that most of us would not talk about, but he's funny as hell. And I think you can tell if you sit through an hour, he's an anti-racist. He's playing with race everywhere, and imperialism and the different regions of the world. So, I mean, most of the mainstream comedians in our country, I think Jimmy Kimmel punches up now. Colbert, who's become too much of a Democrat for my liking, still punches up and not down. Um, I feel that it's the comedians on TV that have helped us get through the Trump years, because I know I couldn't have survived without
Well,
these.
despite the Russophobia and the Russians are
Yeah,
hiding
but
the
that's a minor part of what they do. It's a minor part of what these comedians do. And I guess, I mean, I look at the Daily Show. I used to, I taught journalism. You mentioned the years 2008 to 2018. And I would be interviewed in mainstream forums all the time. They said it's something sad about television news that the best journalists on TV are on the Comedy Channel. And I was referring to the Colbert Report, which often did in-depth things, and the Daily Show, hosted by Jon Stewart and then Trevor Noah. They are doing better journalism than mainstream TV news is. And then someone we haven't mentioned is John Oliver, who does investigative journalism better than the television news, and he's a comedy show. It's a sad commentary on television news that you turn to comedians, and you'll often learn more. They have longer sound bites. You watch the nightly news, they'll tell you what Trump said. They won't play 45 seconds of it on the 30-minute nightly news broadcast. But on some of these comedy shows, they'll give you longer sound bites. They'll analyze it. They'll make fun of it. They'll ridicule the racism of it. Then they'll show you more of the sound bite. It's more in depth. No one's more in depth on television than John Oliver, who's a comedy guy.
But sadly, and actually, this is a perfect segue to this other big media head. Colbert will still roll out the red carpet for Henry Kissinger and the Clintons of the world and the Obamas of the world.
I've never seen him do Kissinger. I've never seen him interview Kissinger. That might have turned my stomach, but you're right.
Yeah.
He loves having the Clintons on. Yeah, there's no doubt. When he was, I'm talking about the Colbert. Yeah, the Colbert Report was very progressive. It was, and he had a lot of progressive guests. That's the main thing about FAIR. The dissenters are not even allowed to be guests. If you're on the left and you've written a book, you generally can't even be a guest. And Colbert Report, I remember he had Naomi Klein on once or twice. And he said, well, you're from Canada. He's playing the right-wing Bill O'Reilly character, Colbert Report. You're from Canada. Well, you're a socialist. Of course you hate our country. It was very funny, but she would be able to discuss her book, and the book title would be mentioned 5 times. So you're right. When he went to CBS, it's become more of a let's roll out the red carpet for Democratic Party liberals and mainstream reporters that he often used to make fun of.
And that's actually a perfect segue to Nickel and Dimes with Bill Maher. I'm sorry, Real Time with Bill Maher.
Yeah.
How do you assess?
He gets worse and worse.
Because the sort of complimentary stuff you've just said about the Daily Show and the Colbert Report, I would have said it about Bill Maher, but at the same time, it's very limited because Bill Maher, unlike a George Carlin or a Bill Hicks, won't attack the rotten American system at its heart. He'll
Right.
prop up he'll prop up he'll prop up the the Obamas of the world. He will call out right-wing biases, but at the same time, he, like so many other shock dogs, has become a whiny person who complains too much about wokeism and stuff
Yeah,
like
yeah,
that,
yeah.
and too much political correctness. And if you look at his recent coverage, he always was a Zionist, but if you look at his recent coverage of Israel, it is shocking that Mr. Atheist
Yeah.
is being the unpaid lawyer of a Jewish supremacist apartheid settler
Right.
colonial state which is engaging in genocide right now. So how
Yeah.
do you
Yeah.
assess
Yeah,
Omar?
he gets worse. Seems to get worse and worse. I've seen him. I saw a recent interview. He's debating Erwin Winkler, not, or is it the actor who played the Fonz, Winkler. Um, and it was just ridiculously, he's not a dumb guy, but on some issues he sounds dumb. When he talks about Israel, he just sounds like he's a stupid guy you'd meet in a bar who knows nothing about Israel. So I believe Maher's gotten worse and worse. But I remember Fair was critical of his show when it was on ABC. It
Politically
was,
incorrect.
yeah, politically incorrect, and they would never have a progressive guest. And now at that point, at least he would polarize with the right wing guests instead of agreeing with them as he seems to do a lot now. But he would say, we have, there was a quote, I think in Time magazine, this is how we book a guest. We get someone from the mainstream media, we always get a right winger. And it just never entered his mind that you might get a left winger. So
Well, he thinks
his,
of himself as the ultimate left winger because he
back
believes
then
in
he did.
legalization of pots and
Yeah, yeah,
so forth.
right. Back then he might have thought of himself as left of center. I don't think he does now. He sees himself as a Democrat who's attacking the woke Democrats and the social justice warriors.
Yeah.
So he's not punching up anymore exclusively, he's punching down. And if you embrace the government of Israel, the right-wing racist government of Israel, as he does, and defend the genocide, that's punching down against people of color, against Palestinian people. But I'm going to have to run soon. But yeah, we could go through each of these
Yeah,
people. But I think you framed it right. Yeah,
so he's definitely. I mean, Jon Stewart. He's definitely, Jon Stewart. I think you can jokingly say was liberal-ish, socialist-ish on everything except Palestine because he could have done more to speak out against Zionism.
I thought Jon Stewart.
Bill Maher regressive on everything, especially Palestine.
Yeah, I think Jon Stewart was actually good on Israel. I think he's always joked about this idea that you can't criticize Israel whether you're Jewish or not. I think he's been good for years. And it didn't surprise me that when the celebrity statement came out, it was in Hollywood Reporter, the first celebrities that put their neck out and called for a ceasefire when Biden wasn't claiming to be for a ceasefire. He never really has been. Jon Stewart's name was on the list, Joaquin Phoenix, a lot of good people, but it didn't surprise me that Jon Stewart was there.
How many more questions can I squeeze out of you before you have to go?
A couple more minutes.
Okay. All right. Okay. 3 quick questions. Sorry. So I'll do
And
it.
do one at a time, because
All right.
sometimes you put 3 or 4 people together and I disagree with the way you're smushing them. Yeah.
Okay. Then in that. Okay. Well, let's not. Let's honor one of the honorable exceptions, as Don Pilger would say. And which is talk about Phil Donahue and his legacy. And I also have to say I am very, very sorry for your loss because I know he passed away a few months ago. So how do you look back at his legacy, good, bad, and bad, ugly, and the goods?
Yeah. Yeah. Phil's legacy, I mean, generally it's sterling. Sure, he had some shows that were rating shows with the male strippers, and that's what the media emphasized in some of their editorials.
second, guys.
.org. He took all these issues of civil rights, gay rights, consumer rights, corporate greed, women's rights, and he mainstreamed them to millions and millions of people. Like John Pilger getting his great documentaries on mainstream TV channels in England. Phil was even bigger that way. He got these progressive ideas when they were not popular. I'm talking about beginning in the 60s. Gay rights, women's liberation. He was mainstreaming those issues. So I was happy to get to know him. I was on his shows a few times, his various different shows, including the big daytime show.
And you were on, and you were on as a representative of FAIR, and so he would allow you to have an honest conversation about the problems of corporate media, of which he was a member of then.
Exactly. And I'll give you the best example. In the 1990s, when his big daytime show was still going, it had moved to New York City. They called me and they said they wanted to do a show about what's wrong with media, what's wrong with TV news, what's wrong with corporate mainstream media. And I suggested they also have these other people, including Michael Moore. They had on Jim Hightower, the great progressive populist from Texas, Donna Edwards, who was
Ralph
then
Nader
working
as
with
well.
Ralph Nader. And we did a whole show on what's wrong with the media, a whole hour. And they took what we were talking about earlier, the phony center-right spectrum purporting to be a full spectrum of left versus right. And he blew up, his staff blew up. They had a massive thing on the stage right next to our table where we're sitting around with Phil. This massive poster, which was the full page ad that FAIR used to take out in magazines. And the headline was, it was a takeoff on the commercial, "I'm not a doctor, but I play one on TV." Our headline of our full page ad, "I'm not a leftist, but I play one on TV." And it was a picture of all of these guys on PBS and CNN who represented the left. Michael Kinsley, Mark Shields, Al Hunt, who represented the left repeatedly on CNN while he was the Washington bureau chief of the Wall Street Journal. That's not exactly the left. And Phil said, "I'd like explain that. What is your point?" And I was able to do like a few minutes on the phony left-right spectrum that's actually corporate spectrum, center to right. And that's Phil Donahue's massive daytime show. And I heard later from one of the top executives at CNN that he watched the show. So he saw me attacking CNN on a show that was even bigger than CNN. So Phil Donahue, to me, is a legend. He's also was a beautiful character, a loving husband of a leading feminist actress, Marlo Thomas. Besides his progressive political activity, he always supported FAIR. He came to our benefits and we would be the MC or he would make a little speech. You know, he and Marlo raised all this money for this wonderful charity called St. Jude's Hospital, which is a children's hospital where no parent has to pay a penny. It pioneers in cancer research, children's cancer. And Phil and Marlo raised millions and millions and millions of dollars for that charity. It was started by Marlo's dad, Danny Thomas, who was he was a Lebanese American. I think most Arab Americans in my country can trace their ancestry to Lebanon. And he was one of the great Lebanese Americans. Danny Thomas was in the media. Marlo Thomas was in the media. And the great disc jockey was also a supporter of FAIR, Casey Kasem, who was a Lebanese American and a big supporter of Palestinian rights.
I believe Ralph Nader is of a Lebanese
Yes.
Greek background as well, so that's quite interesting.
Yeah. And Ralph Nader, to his credit, has always been a supporter of Palestinian rights. He did it behind the scenes a lot in the early years. but every Palestinian rights leader or group knows that Ralph was helping them, even when he was doing it behind the scenes. Yeah, Ralph's another legend. And Ralph and Phil were close friends. They helped build each other's careers. The most frequent guests on the daytime Donahue show, which was huge, and it opened the door for Oprah Winfrey. The most frequent guests were Ralph Nader, Jesse Jackson, the civil rights leader, and Gloria Steinem, the women's rights leader. Those were the three most frequent guests. They appeared dozens and dozens of times, each of them. That's how you mainstream. I mean, at FAIR, we always thought.
And interesting how Ralph has continued to be a leftist, even if I may not agree with his left-right alliance. Jesse Jackson, Black Agenda Report, would definitely call him a Black Men's Leadership Class member.
I
and
wouldn't.
Steinem was an admitted CIA agent.
Yeah, but that was before. That was before. See, I disagree with you about both Jesse. I'm close. I'm a big supporter of Jesse's. And I know all the criticism of him. I think he's on the right side of every issue. He opposed NAFTA, which was important for a Black leader to do. He was one of the first Black leaders to support Palestinian rights. He was one of the first Black leaders to support gay rights. And Gloria Steinem, you know, to me, the main thing I object to, and I like Gloria, was she supported Hillary over Bernie and she did it in an awful way, in my view. But to Gloria's credit, she supported Palestinian rights at some crucial times. And that's not something you do if you're a complete sellout. Her relationship with the CIA, as I understand it, was similar to a lot of liberals in the 50s. During the height of the Cold War, they saw the FBI as just racist right wing, and they saw the CIA as more enlightened Cold Warriors who respected civil rights. You know, that was there are many liberals who worked with the CIA in the 50s, including Victor Reuther, the union leader, the brother of Walter Reuther, and then he came out and denounced them later. And certainly, I haven't heard Gloria talking about, and again, these people weren't like full-time CIA officers. They did stuff in front groups where the CIA was paying the bills. Some of them didn't even know it. I assume Gloria had a good clue, but there were some people.
Oh, go ahead.
Some people in the National Student Association leadership didn't know it, that the CIA was funding it. And Victor Reuther knew where he was getting his money when he was working with socialist unions against communist unions in Europe. But he wrote half of a book saying, I can't believe what I did. It was appalling what I did.
So, and when you look back at Donahue, so safe to say, if you actually were to do a very good documentary on his body of work and his legacy, he would definitely be what John Pilger would describe as an honorable exception in corporate.
No doubt. Like Pilger, he wasn't as left wing as Pilger, but he certainly reached more people than Pilger. Phil Donahue was taking these progressive issues into mainstream culture, largely a female audience, largely a non-political audience. And I consider Phil Donahue a giant. I feel he accomplished so much for progressive ideas. It's just almost incalculable. I've never heard a bad word about him.
Well, it's funny that you say that, because when I was saying to you to describe Donahue, the bad, the ugly, and the goods, for most of what I've read about Phil Donahue, and this is on Wikipedia, often says that he had a good show, and then in the '90s it became trash. It became trash TV. Hence why he was fired. Then he had a very good show, Donahue Live, which you were a producer, and then sadly it was
See, I disagree.
it was
I
shut down.
disagree.
So
Yeah,
that's why I find it very interesting.
yeah, I disagree with the idea that he went into the gutter in the 90s. He did. I mean, remember, this was already the time where Geraldo had a show. I mean, there were shows that just did crap every single day. Donahue would do a rating show once in a while. But near the end, when he's allegedly in the gutter, he did the show on what's wrong with corporate domination of mainstream media. What's wrong with corporate news? No one did that. Maybe Moyers did it on occasion on PBS. And he's another exception to the rule who got great stuff done in mainstream media. But Phil never went totally in the gutter. I mean, he liked, see, Phil was also a sexual libertarian. So am I. I believe in you don't judge someone else's sexuality unless they're hurting people. So, Phil wore a dress on the show. And he would, the mainstream, a lot of them made fun of him. I think Phil believed he knew he was getting ratings and he knew everyone would be talking about it, but he also believed in it. He believed in gay rights. He believed in you don't judge someone else's sexuality. And there's probably no one alive in my country that did as much for that sentiment as Phil Donahue. I can't think of anyone. So I just don't buy it that he went into the gutter. The other shows did, and he sort of had to do some of those ratings type shows, but he never went in the gutter. He was never a Geraldo or a Jerry Springer.
Exactly. And my two last questions then are this, which is
And I'm gonna have to give you shorter answers. Yeah.
It's okay, Jeff.
Yeah.
I love hearing from you, so
Yeah.
it's all good.
Yeah.
So right now, as we speak, England, they are celebrating the life of John Pilger. They're showing a bunch of his documentary. They're showing documentaries he personally liked, and yeah, basically celebrating his life. So talk to us about my hero, who definitely was also an honorable exception because he worked in the Daily Mirror. All of his documentaries were on ITV. There's a brief time he was back in the Daily Mirror under a Piers Morgan, if you can believe that. So please do pay.
Yeah. Yeah. John Pilger.
Pilger.
John Pilger is a hero.
Did you ever
50
meet him in person, actually?
I didn't, but he came to the fair office when I wasn't there. The people at fair met him. I happened to be not in the office. Yeah, he's an unbelievable figure. If you're not familiar with who he is, you should go online and watch some of his stuff. I think it's called, it said that he did 50 documentaries. Many of them were on mainstream TV. The War You Don't See is one of his more famous ones. But he was a champion of Aboriginal rights in Australia. He always fought against racism. He was a guy who was willing to take a stand. The corporate liberals did not like him. You're too ultra left, you're too this, you're too that, you're too shrill, you're sensationalist, you exaggerate, because he was a foe of Western imperialism and colonialism. That's very rare in Western media to be a foe of colonialism and imperialism, to believe that, our side is generally right, but makes some mistakes, like Vietnam's a mistake, but we got to do something about these dark-skinned terrorists. It's like he was against all that. His stuff is incredible. He was a big supporter of Assange throughout the whole imprisonment and earlier. So yeah, if people don't know about John Pilger, it's easy to find his stuff online.
By the way, and I can answer briefly this question of yours, which is how did I discover FAIR? How do I know all of this?
Yeah.
John Pilger plugged FAIR in one of his speeches criticizing corporate media, corporate state media, and when he was praising independent media, he mentioned FAIR and he said the splendid work of FAIR. So that's how I discovered you guys. And of course, Steve Rendell, formerly of FAIR, was in the documentary The War You Don't See. So that's how
Right.
I discovered your work.
Right. I think he,
Without him, I would have never got into the rabbit hole of all the left-wing journalism I do consume, whether it's Democracy
I
Now!,
see.
World Socialist website, MediaLens.org, Consortium News, Robert Perry, Counterpunch, and the, Alexander Coburn, and so forth. So
Yeah.
all of that is due to John Pilger.
I think when Pilger interviewed Rendell, I think it was at the fair office, but I wasn't there that day.
Oh, pity,
I would have,
pity.
I would have given him a big hug because I already knew his work.
And yes, and I think the last thing I have to ask, because I can't leave the conversation without asking this, is now what has the overconsumption, the force feeding of far right journalism, what you call center right to far right journalism, has it have we all become so immune to it, whether it's in Australia, whether it's in Britain, whether it's in the US, that when a far right candidate and a far right demagogue in the form of a Donald Trump or Scott Morrison or Tony Abbott or Boris Johnson or Nigel Farage, have we all just become so immune to far right bigotry that when a real life Rush Limbaugh is running for office, instead of us actively again calling out the racism, we're calling out the racism and so forth, we're just so immune to it to the point where, as you say, I don't like Kamala Harris, but Trump, guys, Kamala Harris.
Yeah, yeah.
And I still, and part of me still thinks that we should hold our noses, vote Kamala Harris, and like Yasser Louadi said in France, we block Marine Le Pen from getting to office, and then we mobilize like hell against the austerity agenda and the war agenda of a Macron. And
Yeah, I agree. I agree with that analysis politically. In my country, because we have the Electoral College, you only have to hold your nose and vote Democratic if you live in a battleground state, which is about 7 states. Otherwise, you can cast a third party vote. You can write in Noam Chomsky, as I'm probably going to do. But in terms of your question, I'll give you a very short answer, and it gets back to an earlier program you'd already taped. People want to know how Donald Trump became possible in our country. It's from 20 years of right-wing propaganda reaching millions and millions of people that became the base of the MAGA movement. And the movie Jen Senko made, The Brainwashing of My Dad, it was made right as Trump is ascending. Trump's hardly even in the movie, but it's the best movie to understand how Trump is possible. That if you didn't have the decades of scapegoating Muslims, scapegoating immigrants, scapegoating people on welfare, scapegoating homeless, they're the problem. It's not corporate greed. It's not that we spend more money on the military than anything else. It's these people. That went on for decades, and it made Trump to millions of people, especially less educated. And remember, Trump said, I love the uneducated. I love the low, what was his exact word? I love the
low information voters, or
no, it
IQ
was
voters?
education. We have highly educated,
poorly
and
educated.
we have, yeah. I love the poorly educated. And a lot of poorly educated people are clued into, they were to Limbaugh, they still are to Fox News. But I'll finish on this note. FAIR has a slogan, and I have their T-shirt. And it applies not just to right-wing media, but it applies many times harder to right-wing than corporate centrist media. News. Rich people paying rich people to tell middle-class people to blame the poor. Now, Fox News does that explicitly every day. And New York Times does that more subtly. When I watched the corporate liberal media of San Francisco run the progressive DA out of office through a recall, Chesa Boudin, it was the corporate liberal media illustrating the fair slogan, rich people paying other rich people to tell middle-class people to blame the poor. They were blaming Chesa Boudin for crime as if he created it. He'd been in office less than a year. For homelessness as if he created that problem. It's not about structural housing. So that's what liberal media are willing to do in a crisis when they wanted to get rid of Chesa Boudin, the left-wing DA. So the corporate liberal media in the center and the right-wing media, that's what they mostly do. But the right-wing media, they do it every hour and it's blatant. And that's what as you say, paved the road for Trump to ride in. I've got to run. All right. Nice talking to you, Youri.
Well, we were joined on this edition of 1+1 with Jeff Cohen, who, let me remind folks, is the founder of Farness and Accuracy in reporting. He currently does work with rootsaction.org. And folks, get all of his books that he's written and co-authored, but especially get his book, Cable News Confidential, My Misadventures in Corporate Media. And Jeff, thank you so much. I'm looking forward to having you coming on again at the future dates when this latest election, selection, whatever you want to call it, happens. I'm sure we're going to have
we won't know the result. We won't know the result perhaps for many days or weeks or months. All right. Nice talking to you.
But thank you so much. Keep doing the great work you do. And once again, Phil Donahue, gracias la vida, viva his spirit, and John Pilger.
Great. Great. Bye-bye.